Everybody, and welcome to George Washington University. I am very pleased to see all of you here today, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about GW's program and Internet issues and Internet governance first. Today's event is brought to us all by the Progressive Policy Institute and an anonymous donor. We very much at GW like to partner with various organizations to develop events on Internet governance and digital trade issues. So please contact me if you'd like to partner. We, for example, partner very frequently with the Internet Society. We're very grateful that they are webcasting this event. And so, again, please contact me if you would like to partner with us. In particular, we're looking for support for scholarships for our students seeking to study these issues. We already run a fellowship program for graduate students in this area, the eBay Policy Scholars, which this year was won by two students sitting here, Sylvia Wu and Tian Wao. Now to the program. As you know, the digital economy is constantly changing and is very hard to measure, as the outflow of data may not be the same as the inflow of data, right? Moreover, scholars don't agree as to whether or not information flows are actually traded. So, at the behest of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the International Trade Commission has made an important start at both measuring the Internet economy and examining trade barriers. So James Stamps will begin our discussion by presenting the report, and he will be followed by four experts with distinct perspectives on the digital economy. We have Michael Mandel, Jacquelynn Ruff, Linda Kinney, and Jake Colvin. And you can read their bios in the attachment that we handed out, because I'd like to give them as much time as possible. Each speaker will speak for 7 minutes, and then we'll open the floor up for questions. So let's begin with Mr. Stamps from the ITC. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan, for that introduction. I just want to say by way of overview for those of you who may not be familiar with the ITC, International Trade Commission. ITC is a bipartisan independent federal agency established by Congress to provide information and advice to the executive branch and to Congress. ITC is not a policy-making agency. As part of its duties, ITC serves as the government's think tank on a variety of issues related to international trade. And it's in this capacity as a think tank that we were asked by the Senate Finance Committee to do these recent reports on digital trade. So it's indeed a pleasure to be with all of you here today to discuss the major findings from our reports on digital trade. I'll just mention at the outset, we've done two reports on digital trade. The first one came out in July of 2013, July of last year. I'm here really to talk about the second report that just came out in August of this year, but I may occasionally reference that first report. In my remarks, I will provide a broad overview of the report's major findings. But before I begin, I do want to acknowledge that I'm representing the work of many folks back at ITC, some of whom are in the room today. My deputy project leader, David Coffin, Kate Winton, my boss, Arona Butcher, Josh Levy, a bunch of folks here. I say that if your questions get a little too challenging for me, I may need to turn over to them, to their expertise, to provide you more detailed answers. I also want to say that we understand that there is a keen interest in the policy implications associated with digital trade. I do have to mention that in order to safeguard our role at ITC as providers of independent and factual information, our team here, will not address the policy implications or policy recommendations, but I encourage you to have that discussion.
As long as it doesn't involve you.
So I'll start first with just a quick overview of the reports, just to make sure everybody's on the same page here. So Senate Finance asked ITC to do these two fact-finding reports on digital trade. Specifically, we were asked to describe digital trade, to assess the linkages and contributions of digital trade to the U.S. economy, to estimate the value of digital trade and the importance of digital trade to selected industries, especially to U.S. SMEs, as well as to examine the effects of notable barriers and impediments, foreign barriers and impediments to U.S. Digital trade. And then to help do all of this, Senate Finance asked us to do a survey of U.S. businesses in order to collect firm-level data. We also had public hearings. We had a public hearing in D.C. We actually went to Silicon Valley and had a hearing there, which is unusual for the commission to actually travel on a hearing out of D.C. But we had excellent help with the D.C. area industry reps. We wanted to talk firsthand to the companies themselves, which tend to be located in the West Coast. We had meetings and interviews with industry officials across the country. Of course, we surveyed the economic literature and data sources that are available. So before I begin, I want to give you two definitions that are really critical if you have not had a chance to look at our reports, as you look at them. The first is digital trade, and just to let you know how we define that. There are lots of studies and reports on e-commerce, international trade, or however you want to call it. Each one tends to have its own definition. For our second report, we focused on products and services ordered or sold online, regardless of how they were actually delivered. So they could have been downloaded or streamed. They could have arrived via a UPS or FedEx truck, or the service could have been delivered in person. In the survey, we asked respondents to specify how products and services were delivered. But for us, the key issue here was products or services ordered or sold online. Second definition I'll give you, Senate Finance asked us to look at industries particularly involved in digital trade, and we referred to those as digitally intensive industries. We defined those as covering about 140,000 U.S. firms identified by ITC staff using several metrics. These firms, 140,000 firms, covered roughly 7 sectors, and they're detailed in the report. I'll just mention them here to bring them in the room. They were the content industries, digital communication industries, finance and insurance, manufacturing, retail, selected other services, and wholesale. One of the difficulties in doing a survey is every industry, every firm has to be placed into one of these boxes. It's often very hard to make the call, what is Google or what is Apple or what is, these are large firms with many different products and services, and it's certainly a challenge we faced in doing our survey. As I said, our universe was 140,000 digitally intensive firms. We sent our survey to about 10,000 of those firms. It was a stratified random sample, and we had about a 41% response rate. So that's it for preliminaries. I'll go on to the findings.
1% is good.
We understand it's quite good, yeah. Although we did invoke the ITC has a subpoena power, and that is prominently placed on our
It's good
front
even
page.
with subpoena power.
So on to the findings. I'm going to start with the key findings from the survey. Again, and this is real original firm-level data. We're quite proud of the survey results. And I'm just going to pick a few examples to discuss here. First, U.S. online sales, and this is for 2012. Online sales, almost $1 trillion, $935 billion, firms reported. Again, this is survey results. Of that total, 30% delivered online, and that's largely in the firms in the digital communications sectors, such as software and internet-based services. So 30% delivered online, 66% delivered physically, interestingly enough, and that's about half of that was manufacturing. So of the total sales, again, that $935 billion in 2012, of that total, about a quarter, about $223 billion, were exported. 41% of those exports delivered online, about 59% delivered physically. The online deliveries were mostly digital communications, and physical deliveries were mostly manufacturing again. One of the more interesting things I got from the survey was that firms, and again, we're talking about firms in these digitally intensive sectors, firms use the internet in different ways. Interestingly, selling products and services online is actually showed to be less important than many other activities, such as internal communications, ordering physical products, and business communications. So the internet, for firms report it as much more than just selling stuff to customers. Firms are actually using the internet a lot extensively in their back office operations to improve their productivity, and for services that they deal with their customers and their suppliers and vendors. So now I'll move on to key findings from our CGE model. We use for those of you familiar with CGE modeling, we use the GTAP model, the Global Trade Analysis Project model, which is a multi-country, multi-sector model for our economy-wide findings. So I just mentioned from the survey, firms said that they use the internet in many different ways. One of the things firms reported in the survey is that the internet contributes significantly to their productivity, and that the internet significantly reduces their international trade costs. So what we were able to do from the survey results was we were able to quantify some of these effects and then plug these into the model. So again, for those of you familiar with the CGE modeling framework, the shocks that we use, we were able to use the productivity shock and then this lower trade cost shock in the model. And that's what gave us our economy-wide findings. So what we found in the model was that through the combined effects of internet-enhanced productivity and lowered trade costs in the digitally intensive industries, firms experienced roughly 3.4 to 4.8%. There's a 3.4 to 4.8% in U.S. GDP, which translates into an increase of about 517 to 711 billion dollars increase in U.S. GDP. Now, the base year for the model was 2011, but our modeler tells me that we can just think of this just in a given year. This is the boost to the economy in a given year. The model also showed that because of the enhanced productivity and reduced trade costs, U.S. real wages were higher, and also depending on the employment assumptions that you use in the model, total employment, aggregate employment in the United States also was higher. What I will say is that we should note that these results are largely based on the effects of, again, the shocks were applied to the digitally intensive sectors of the economy. Had we applied the shocks to the non-digitally intensive sectors, undoubtedly the results would have been bigger. Next, I'll move on to some of our findings on the barriers and impediments to digital trade. In the first report that we did, we used interviews with industry representatives and experts to call their list of barriers and impediments to digital trade. And then in our survey, we asked firms about their experience with these barriers. We had a rich discussion and quite a bit of information from this. I don't have time to go through them all, but I actually will just read the list of barriers again to bring these into the room so that you're familiar with them. And those barriers were localization requirements, market access limitations, data privacy and protection requirements, IPR infringement, unclear legal liabilities, censorship, and customs measures. Again, these were identified by U.S. firms. And the results varied by sector in terms of how heavily they affected the firms, depended on the sector as well as the size of the firm. We also, in our analysis of barriers, asked the firms to rate other countries in terms of the prevalence or the extent to which barriers impeded their ability to do business in other countries. It's an interesting table in the report. The countries rated by firms with the highest barriers were Nigeria and Algeria. Final thing I'll talk about was the case studies that we have in the report. Senate Finance was very interested in getting some granular details, some good stories about how the internet works in the society and some examples of firms' experiences. So we drew on some of the broader pictures that we discussed in the first report. We had several themes in our case studies. We had a theme about how the internet is increasing and encouraging new business opportunities, sometimes by disrupting existing business models. We talked about the role of the cloud and big data. We highlighted the global competitiveness of U.S. internet companies. U.S. internet companies still are globally competitive, but we noticed that increasingly there is more competition, with certainly from markets like China and Russia. The countries are developing their own markets, and we see more foreign companies present in the U.S. market. Finally, we talked about how the internet has facilitated, in particular, SME exports. So with that, I'm probably a little over my time. That concludes my overview of the ITC Digital Trade Report. And as you can see, the report covers a lot of information. We used many different approaches, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you so much, Mr. Stamps. Okay, so now we're going to have the comments, and we're going to begin with Dr. Michael Mandel, Chief Economic Strategist of the Progressive Policy Institute.
Thank you very much. Let me make sure this is, can everybody hear me? Good, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. First, let me thank Susan for inviting myself and the Progressive Policy Institute to this wonderful forum. I was one of the people who testified on the first round, and I was very impressed with the ITC effort then. And now, when I sort of saw this report, I was bowled over. PPI has made, as people probably know, is a think tank that's been around almost 25 years now, and we've tried to change with the times. And one of the things that we focus on these days is the data-driven economy. All of the aspects of the data-driven economy, and we try to think about the policy implications, okay? Because that's what our task is, because we have the word policy in our title. When I saw this report, I was incredibly impressed, both at the breadth of what it covered, at the quality of the results. I was very impressed with the case studies, and the survey was absolutely fantastic. And so it's going to turn out to be a source of statistics, authoritative statistics, for a long time to come in an area in which statistics are hard to come by. Having said all these nice things, and I'm not going to say anything bad about the report at all, I actually just want to take a step beyond and point out a couple of important ways that things you need to remember going forward when you interpret this report. Now, I actually hope that you folks will correct me if I'm wrong about this. Okay. So this report with the survey was able to identify uses of cross-border trade for back offices. Okay, there's people depending on connections across borders. I think it's important to say, though, that these uses, I don't think most of these actually showed up in the numbers. And let me explain to you why. And I'm going to refer to a paper that came out of PPI earlier this year called Data, Trade, and Growth, where we looked at some of the statistics on cross-border trade, and it turns out that a lot of cross-border trade and cross-border data flows do not show up in the conventional trade statistics. And there's a very simple reason for that, which is that the way that trade is measured in this country and every country is by looking at monetary footprints. That is to say, if you look at the handbook for the Bureau of Economic Analysis about cross-border trade and services, it basically happens when there's a monetary transaction between an American person, a domestic person, and a foreign person, where a person is the Verizon person on the panel knows this very well, is that because the backbone companies are often peering with each other, which means that data flows from one company to another without any actual monetary transaction. And the paper that PPI came out with actually sort of delves deep into the sub-basement of the statistics infrastructure, places where you don't want to go, where the rats all live and the water is dripping and so forth. And basically, there's an awful lot of cross-border data flows which fall into these survey categories, which never get picked up in the official statistics. Okay, so the first point is that the size of cross-border international transactions is actually substantially larger and probably growing much faster. As a conservative estimate, and not conservative capital C, but conservative in the sense that economic statisticians like to be conservative, is that it's measuring what we can measure. Okay, we know there's a lot more. That for a lot of the cross-border data flows are not showing up anywhere in the statistics. The second issue, and this kind of bears on the protectionism and localization. There's a fundamental misunderstanding, especially in Europe, about what's really happening with these cross-border data flows, what the real impact is. And I know the report sort of mentioned a couple of times that companies were citing EU localization and EU data protection policies as a big issue. It's important to remember that cross-border data flows have a first-order effect on growth that imports of goods and services do not. That is to say, if you think about it, if I sort of ship a car from the US to Germany, or from the Germany to US, that car used to be in Germany, now is in the US. It can't be in both places simultaneously. That's not true for data. Okay? And in particular, when you're talking about things like technology, market information, the whole range of data which is productivity enhancing, which you folks do a terrific job on, all of these pieces of data are globally first order growth enhancing. So what this means is that a country or region that cuts off the flow of data is having a first order negative effect on their own growth. Now, this has an enormous number of policy implications for taxation, for trade, for movements of people. PPI has a project going on right now looking at taxation, especially the relationship between cross-border data flows and taxation and the first-order effects on growth. Okay, I think that's an important fact here, but let me just come back and say this is a fantastic report and should be viewed as a landmark event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mandel, for those provocative and important comments. Okay, our next speaker is Jacquelynn Ruff, who is Vice President International of Verizon. And sorry to cut everybody off at 7 minutes, but we appreciate it. Thank you, Jacquelynn.
Thank you. I need to push this. So thank you for organizing this panel and including Verizon in it, and thank you very much to the ITC and to the project leader for having done this excellent report. It's very important, as the previous speaker said, for a number of reasons, and I too would characterize it as landmark and also kind of opening the way to further discussions and further conversations, I think, about the scope of digital trade. Verizon's intersection with all this is that outside of the U.S., we are a large provider of the internet backbone. We have a network, global network, with capacity in more than 80 undersea cables and some satellite capacity, but most of the cross-border non-terrestrial data is going over these fiber optic undersea cables. And we provide enterprise services outside the U.S. So say to banks, the financial industry, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, anything like that. 99% of the Fortune 500 have Verizon for at least part of their global communications, and by definition these days, digital communication services. It's the connectivity, the carrying of all that data, and increasingly sort of moving up the value stack to include cloud services, M2M, et cetera. So this huge transformation in the sector, types of services we're providing to all of these different types of companies, is transforming rapidly, and I think it's actually very challenging to accurately capture it all. And so this particular report, you had the definition that you mentioned, which had to do with, let's see, products and services that are ordered and sold online, which is a particular type of thing. And a company like ours might be in the position of saying, well, wait a minute, of the services, these digital services that we have, how many are ordered and sold online? So that would be a subset of it. And I think it was therefore particularly commendable that you went beyond just that definition, and your GDP figures, as if I'm understanding it correctly, are what is the internet per se doing, rather than just those that are ordered and sold online. So we've got sort of two sets of data that are very important. But it certainly resonated with us to see what the conclusions were about the huge scale of all of this, and the important effect on the GDP, because that's, if we just think about the services that even we offer to these enterprises in the U.S. as well as globally, we know there's a huge impact. And I think a lot of it is of the nature that Michael was talking about. In fact, it's the back office, it's the productivity, it's enabling the creation of new services, whether it's e-health, sustainability, smart autos, smart cities, all of this that's so important and happening globally. What it made me think about was other types of studies that are out there, and whether there is some way that we can sort of put all those together. I began imagining this sort of giant kind of Venn diagram with this one captures this other one does this. We always used to complain that the only thing the Commerce Department captured was telecommunications, pure trading of minutes back and forth through paid transactions. Well, okay, that's still a piece of it, but it's a smaller piece, and sort of figure out what the broader picture is in that way. The other thing that I notice a lot that I think is related are studies that show the impact of innovation on GDP growth. Verizon recently, last couple months, worked with the Harvard Business School to look at first movers in kind of technology transformation, sort of digital pioneers, and the what was done to the success of firms that were doing that, and noticing in that study the fact that many firms that are smaller or that are in emerging markets get a proportionately greater benefit, almost like a leapfrogging kind of thing. So that would be part of what I would put in all my Venn diagrams to try to understand the full scope of everything that's happening. Now, all of those things are affected by the barriers that were noted in this study, because when I went to the barriers, they are, in fact, very much, I think, the barriers for these different dimensions. So certainly the cross-border data flows issue is really important, and there's a lot of good work, and we hope that the readers of this report will take it from a policy perspective. Similarly, the market access restrictions, even fundamental things like being able to own 100% of your telecommunications services that are part of the packages around the world. In our own view of things, what we think is that in this period of huge technological transformation, we need really streamlined, light touch regulations rather than some of the heavier-handed ones that are now playing out in the localization. So perhaps we'll have some conversation on that. But really appreciate the work that has been done to feed into all of these spaces. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that insight, especially into the gap in information and good data and how we need to somehow coalesce it. Our next speaker is Linda Kinney, who is the Senior Vice President of the Motion Picture Association of America.
Hi. You hear me now? Yes. Okay. Microphone is now on.
Hi, thank you very much for this opportunity to come and address this crowd, especially Susan Aaronson for her diligent efforts to bring these issues and before a live group and be able to ask and answer questions in a forum. So I really appreciate her efforts, and also ISOC for pulling together these sorts of conversations, because I think they're really important. One of the reasons they're really important, and this report in particular is very well timed, is because the OECD has announced that it's going to have a ministerial on the digital economy in 2016 in Mexico. So they're going to be looking at the digital economy, and what's so great about this report and so different, I think, than prior attempts to look at this digital landscape is that the ITC has, again, like Verizon mentioned, broadened the scope in a way that I think is very beneficial by defining digital industries broader than just the pipe. Again, Jackie talked about Department of Commerce that used to look at just minutes that go back and forth. Now we're talking about a much bigger landscape. I mean, the internet includes so much more than just either the pipe or the minutes going over the pipe. And in fact, the ITC did a great job, I think, capturing some of these other things that have not previously been captured, such as content. So the definition in this report, what I think is so groundbreaking and interesting, seems obvious to me, but hadn't really been done in the same way before, is that content is described in the report and is defined as publishing, and it includes all kinds of books, mailing lists. It also includes motion pictures, so the films that our member companies produce, as well as broadcasting and music production. So there are so many parts of the internet that are really valuable, particularly America. We're one of the leaders in developing content, and it's great that this report is capturing that component that, again, I think is sort of a very interesting aspect of this particular publication. Just to underscore that, the report looks at two things that impact our industry in particular. One is the benefits and that the film industry and other content providers provide to the U.S. economy. And to underscore that, in 2012, we provided the content industry as a whole, not just the film industry, but about $1 trillion to the U.S. economy. We supported nearly 5.4 million good U.S. jobs. Those are typically higher paying than most. And $142 billion in foreign sales and exports. So again, we are very much a positive trade surplus industry for the U.S. Obviously very difficult at this time and this age with all the challenges with the U.S. economy. Having a positive trade surplus is actually quite a good thing in my view. So I think that the second aspect, besides looking at and capturing the benefits to the U.S. economy, then we talk about the trade barriers. And the trade barriers also, I think, are very interesting. Jackie mentioned a couple with respect to her industry, but also for ours. Intellectual property infringement was identified as a significant barrier, at least for the content industry. Market access limits, again. Certain countries only allow so many films to enter the country. And then also censorship. From our perspective, that's a big issue because for this country, freedom of expression is taken for granted. But in a lot of countries, they won't let our films go into those countries because of political speech, because of violence, sexuality. There are other issues. You can always get access to those, and we're used to that. But most countries, or not most countries, but a lot of countries do restrict that. So that's a big issue from our perspective. I think one thing that's very interesting that has come up in the recent IGF, the Internet Governance Forum in Istanbul, is looking at this area in terms of a trusted environment. And some of the things that the ITC pointed out but didn't really put under that umbrella, I think do apply. One of the things that wasn't identified as a trade barrier, but it was in sort of further along in the report on page 2 206, the ITC does talk about secure and easy online payment systems. That was one of the things that came up in Istanbul also as a challenge to a lot of U.S. industries, particularly content, well, not necessarily content producers, but companies like Netflix that are interested in going into different countries. And the uncertain legal environment in that country, in those countries, in particular for us, is piracy. And we've noticed in weaker copyright enforcement countries, companies like Netflix, for example, they have a real difficult time entering those countries because they can't really compete with free. So until that enforcement tightens up, that becomes an issue. And we've also noticed, if you look at Korea, who has also strengthened its copyright enforcement, it's interesting because it did that to protect its local content industry. So in order to have your local content that you're developing to kind of express yourself culturally, you also need to crack down on piracy because no one's going to buy your local content if they can get everything else for free. So I think that's an interesting twist, something to look at in the future and in the context of this type of report. So overall, great job.
Thank you, Ms. Kinney. We really appreciate those insights into additional trade barriers. Our final speaker is Jake Colvin, who is not only Vice President of the National Foreign Trade Council, but also created a new group there, the Global Innovation Forum. Jake?
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you for having me. And, Mike said that the first word that he thought of when he looked at the report was impressive, if you don't mind. I looked at it and I thought daunting. And I was particularly daunted when Susan called last week and asked me to substitute for Usman Ahmed from eBay, who couldn't be here today. And so for those of you, now I have to be competent beyond the executive summary, and I am, barely. But in any case, I think the report, given the size, presents something for everyone. I wanted to focus on 3 points that are of interest to the communities that I work with and represent. And the first is something that everyone has touched on already, which is I think the report does an excellent job in suggesting the importance of the digital trade to the real economy. Now, Mike pointed out not all of the numbers can be quantified, but for an association like NFTC, which is a broad-based trade association, we're glad to count Google and Microsoft and eBay as members, but we're also glad to count General Electric and Samsung and Walmart and Siemens as members as well. And so there's this McKinsey statistic that suggests that 3/4 of the value of productivity gains from the internet goes to the non-internet economy. That's really important. And so the types of activities that James had suggested, the internal communications, marketing, design, and research, are all things that our companies engage in around the world and that rely on an open and secure digital economy. I really like the case study that the ITC went into on machine-to-machine communications and the Internet of Things, which is something that a lot of our large manufacturers like GE, Siemens, and Samsung are involved in and thinking a lot about. I also thought it was important, James, for you to unlock what the term digitally intensive industries meant in the report, because when I glanced at that for the first time, I thought, wow, maybe financial services and retail and the Googles of the world. And it turns out if you go to the footnote in your definition, it means all the things that you said it means. It means chemical industries, industrial machinery, medical equipment, content, motor vehicles, on and on. And that's really important because I do think that's where a lot of the value is. And I actually think that, for reasons I'm about to suggest, that 140,000 enterprises that are digitally intensive is probably a low estimate. So that brings me to the second point, which is that I appreciated the emphasis that this report places on the value of digital trade to stakeholders beyond multinational corporations. And James mentioned the request was to include the impact on small and medium-sized businesses. Now, one of the things that I'm doing, that Susan mentioned, is through the Global Innovation Forum, I'm trying to engage startups, small businesses, development communities, and universities in conversations about how they innovate and engage globally in the digital age. So I think the report does a very good job focusing on small and medium-sized enterprises. James already read some of the statistics that I had written down, so I'm going to refrain from doing that. But it does suggest that I think Main Street businesses are benefiting from the Internet and that there's this democratization of the global economy going on because of the Internet. The thing that I've found, though, and I think one place where maybe there is room for further study by the ITC, is the extent to which startups, NGOs, and university communities, researchers, academics, students, participate and contribute to and benefit from the global economy because of the Internet. And so we've gotten to know some NGOs like Kiva.org, the Grameen Foundation, Sesame Workshop, which is Sesame Street, and some really innovative startups that are engaging in the global economy in the digital age. And the report does provide one case study of big data with respect to the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, where nonprofits were involved in. But I think more could be done to emphasize the extent to which nonprofits and universities and startups are engaged in the global economy. So I know that's a challenge because the ITC, these are not necessarily communities where they're going to be very quick to react to an ITC questionnaire, even if there is subpoena power behind it. These are, in some cases, if you think of startups, 10 employees, they're not at scale yet. They're just trying to keep the lights on. But in my experience, there are some wonderful folks that I've gotten to know that put a fine point on how much the world has changed. And so I really appreciated your case study. I was going to give maybe one of my own. And that is, we're hosting an event in London through the Global Innovation Forum at the end of the month on October 24th. And one of the speakers is Bethany Kobe, who founded an organization called Technology Will Save Us, a company called Technology Will Save Us. It designs and manufactures do-it-yourself kits around gardening and gaming that try to attract kids to learn how to build things and then program them. And so one of the things you could do is build your own Game Boy and write software for it. This company has 20 employees, manufactures everything in the United Kingdom, and is looking to scale. But already 50% of their sales are to the United States. And so they want to set up production in the future closer to their customers, including potentially in the United States. And so these are the kinds of stories that I suspect the ITC report didn't capture and which we'd like to elevate a little bit more. The third point, real quickly, which I'd like to make is on the public policy challenges or the barriers to digital trade that the ITC report suggested. I think Jackie did a good job of capturing what those challenges were: local content requirements, market access barriers, discriminatory financial services requirements. We also talked about IP a little bit, which is very important to our members in two ways. The challenges to effective IP protection have grown in the digital age. And one of the things that I was very appreciative of in the report is that it mentioned, it elevated trade secrets and cyber squatting as two issues which are broadly of concern to our membership.
Could you just define cyber squatting for everyone?
Sure. I guess taking domain names that with which you have no affiliation to, and sitting on them and charging people exorbitant amounts of money to buy them back. If I've got that wrong, someone correct me. But I think it's also important to ensure that IP frameworks are constructed in a way that effectively protect intellectual property rights while also permitting the digital economy to function. And those were sort of two issues that you glanced on in your report kind of in separate ways, and I think they really are tied together in terms of an effective framework for public policy. So I think what you didn't do, for reasons why you articulated already, is you didn't emphasize what policymakers ought to do to address these challenges. Now we've thought about that in some detail, but since I'm probably out of time, we'll wait for question and answer. So thank you, Susan.
Thank you, all our speakers, and so let's open the floor up to questions. But please understand, just to reiterate, that James and his colleagues cannot answer public policy questions, so please direct them to our speakers. Okay, so who would like to ask the first question? Sarah, please identify yourself. And if you don't mind going up to the mic.
Excuse me, I'm working with Kent State University for Knowledge Economy.
Can you say your name,
Kent
sir?
State University.
No, your name, sir.
George Mihails. I'm French national, and I'm doing a few years of work with European Commission. My question is about TTIP and audiovisual. As you know, they dropped it. But the Minister of Culture in France changed, and the next minister maybe would like to do something. The new commissioner of European Commission, we have the government of European Union, which is European Commission, then European Union Parliament. So the new players are coming in November. I think I have not read the report, and I don't know how I can access this report online or... Okay, so thank you so much. I will read it. I will fly back to Geneva next Monday. My question is, would it be possible to start with this report? Because there's a misunderstanding. Of course, France is #1 in the world for food and many other things, but it's a big issue, and we do not understand U.S. and you are subsidizing North Carolina and so on. There's a different type of subsidizing. The point is, how can we capture this industry and to make benefit both Europe and USA? The present assumptions and understanding on both sides does not allow us to make serious progress in including audiovisual in TTIP. So, you know, TTIP is Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. I hope I'm right about. So it's the largest free trade agreement ever. And given human rights, freedom to have European Union, USA setting the standards for the world to come, and you know that we have only Japan and also Korea a little bit, we don't have a foundation in the world to protect those industries, creative industries, and human rights and democratization. So it's a bigger stake than just trade. So my question is, how would you address this issue? There's an opening on European Union side, though not stated on the roof of Brussels buildings, but there's a genuine interest in Europe to get audiovisual and TTIP under thing, but the one those representing USA address one angle, others in Europe. So some setting like a workshop like this one with a perspective would be necessary, in my opinion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your question. Linda, do you want to start with an answer?
Well, it sounds like
Sounds like part of the question is also like, is there an appropriate forum to have these conversations and try to move forward in this dialogue? Maybe I should turn that back to the academics, see whether there's an appropriate forum. I agree, these are definitely really big issues. I think the benefit of this ITC report is that it is a presentation of facts, trying to just explain what's going on out there. And one of the reasons why several panelists have talked about it as landmark is because these facts have been hard to gather. It's hard to define what the digital landscape is, what should be included, what shouldn't be included. And so I think the point of this panel really is to talk about the benefit of actually getting these facts out there. And certainly for the U.S., it's critical, and the audiovisual piece is critical. I don't really have an answer to the larger trade conversation because I think that's a longer conversation. But I agree that these are really important issues on the digital economy, and I think this is a good foundation for having the discussion.
Would anyone else like to comment on that?
Let me just add one thing here, which is that what we've learned with trade in general is that openness helps everybody. And there's still a tendency when it comes to cultural that of resorting to a type of protectionism as being sort of natural. And eventually we're going to have to move away from that. So that's part of what I took away from the question and comment. Thanks.
Would anyone else like to comment? Well, as you know, this has been addressed in the UNESCO venue, but not sufficiently. And so maybe we can talk about doing an event on that. Thank you for bringing that question up.
I'm a member of UNESCO task force.
Okay.
For 14 years.
Okay.
So we have to fight with European Union, Japan, and so on. But thank you so much. It is a big issue, so I don't have easy answer. As a full European Commission project for 40 million euro in total, maybe with Japan 5 million euro. There's still much misunderstanding. I think we miss some approach. I hope.
Thank you. Our next question.
I'm Tom Goldberg. I'm with Lineage Technologies. We make secure IT hardware, and I'm the author of Sections 808 and 818 and the Defense Authorization Bill having to do with cybersecurity. So my perspective here is on that side of the equation. we saw Keith Alexander talk about $1 trillion in annual losses due to IP theft and things of that nature. MOD, in a speech before DHS and DOD a week before last, said the West-West losses to that kind of theft are now approaching $5.5 trillion annually. World Economic Forum, a year and a half ago, with its findings of this kind of cyber insecurity, is suggesting that the brakes are going to be put on for a whole variety of reasons, some of them cultural, some of them political, some of them economic. And so I'm wondering if we are having that immovable force collide with the juggernaut of innovation, and do you see that from your perspective, and can it be communicated to the committees on finance in a manner that says you can't deal with one issue, you really have to deal with both? Thank you.
So just if you don't mind waiting up there, so your question is cybersecurity becoming a trade barrier?
I'm actually seeing it as such, yes. And I know from the Verizon perspective, I work with Marcus Sachs on some of that, so I have a little bit of an insight. There are a lot of problems that these ISPs are confronting for a whole variety of reasons, some of it technological, some of it ownership, access, things of that nature, that look to me as though there's a very hard push of the right foot on the brake pedal right now, and I'm just kind of curious about your all reaction, and do you see it as well?
Would anyone like to answer that?
I'll take a shot at it. Look, I'm going to turn this into a statistics question because that's the part that I'm most comfortable with, okay? But let me explain to you why. You just tossed around a couple of large numbers. The question is, what do we compare those to? And part of the problem is that some of the losses that you're talking about, while real, are actually not showing up currently in GDP now as a gain. That is to say, you're talking about back office losses, you're talking about data that is going to have to be slowed down, sort of cut off, constrained. And because we're not actually currently picking up the benefits of that data in GDP, it's hard to see, you're having a tough time getting people's attention, okay? And so part of the beauty of this study is that it's getting, the more that we can measure the benefits, the more credible the estimate of the losses become. Because right now when you toss around words like $1 trillion, right, people's minds kind of fade out. And the reason why is that you're talking about such a large share of what looks like the U.S. economy at this point. This seems a little bit overblown. But if we had a real size about what data was contributing, people might actually be able to get a grip on the importance here.
I'll just give you one quick example, and this is going on in the fight with DuPont's divestiture battle, whether to break out the chemical industry from the specialty and pharma stuff and ag businesses. And that is that they lost TiO2 in a cyber theft, essentially, which was really the nameplate profit arena. So now we have a couple of hedge funds saying, spin that division out. It's really lost its shine. And that's a very demonstrable example. And we've seen others that we can tag in the national security arena that I won't mention here that are very well documented. I think we're at the front end, and your point is well taken. We're at the front end of collecting the data and beginning to aggregate it. But the estimates seem to be reasonably well founded. Keith Alexander wouldn't make testimony so broadly without some foundational piece. And I would suggest that neither would MOD at this juncture, because they're really reflecting in that context a broader EC, EU perspective. That's at least my take on it. Thanks.
Would anyone else like to comment? Jake?
I mean, you just reiterate what I said before, which is that cyber theft, and particularly state-sponsored cyber theft, is an increasing concern to the U.S. business community and our member companies. And I do think that if IP risks get too great, they can impede access to the digital marketplace. You just don't want to put things up online, or you don't want to locate data in certain places. You don't want to trade across borders. But I think that practically the way that this is going to be addressed is through a separate conversation. And you can pile a lot of things into trade agreements. And I think that the TTIP, I can never remember what it stands for. And I do this for a living.
Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership.
Thank you, Steve. I do think that is a place for a lot of what we've been talking about to be addressed in terms of improving access to information flows, to ensure an open internet, to ensure effective intellectual property rights protection. I don't think it's the place for a cybersecurity conversation. And so, you've seen these separate conversations arise at the Department of Commerce in Europe, elsewhere around the world. The one thing that I've heard from our members on this, and we're not experts here, and so we don't play in a lot of these particular conversations, is you need to make sure governments align in what they are doing, because you can have differing, or in some cases conflicting, requirements about what you need to do in one jurisdiction versus another. And it would be much better for those that have global operations, for the Europeans and the U.S. and everyone else to get together and make sure they're on the same page.
Just to follow up on that, are you said that IPR theft belongs in a trade agreement, but are you also calling for a separate sort of set of standards regarding IPR theft, given the issues with the NSA and the U.S. spying on other governments on their trade policy positions, and that was considered a form of cyber theft?
I think the NSA revelations have dramatically complicated our ability to speak with the U.S. government's ability to speak with with clean hands on the issue of cyber theft. And I think it's unfortunate, because if you dig down and listen to what the U.S. government says, the things that they're doing for the reasons that they're doing them are qualitatively different than the things that, say, other large governments in Asia do to our companies and other companies around the world. That said, I think the right way to address intellectual property rights issues on the commercial side is in trade agreements, and you've got a long history of IP chapters in trade agreements that you can look back to suggest what the United States has come up with for rules in those areas. I'm not going to comment on the national security conversation.
Would anyone else like to comment?
Yeah, just to comment on the broader point, which is a point that I think is very important, and again, something that really became a theme at the IGF, which is this idea of a trusted environment, that we need to move beyond this idea that the internet is a lawless place, and that's a good thing, because you're right. Trade, I think it's going to become an increasing problem. It's really going to become a huge problem in these developing economies. And unless the customers feel like they can get online and their credit card information won't be stolen, they won't have cyber attacks, they won't sort of be lured into fraudulent websites that sell fake pharmaceuticals. I think there's a whole new world out there in the internet, and we now are at a stage where that's becoming a really big part of the conversation, and I think it needs to be, and it hasn't been.
Any other comments? Okay, next question.
Thank you, Carl Szabo with NetChoice. So the report came out and said the internet economy is good for America. I think that's pretty obvious, and the panel has agreed upon that. But a lot of the conversation has also been centered on this issue of trade barriers. And Dr. Mandel, you said that if a company decides to erect a trade barrier, it's really only going to hurt that country, that one country, rather than the exporting country. But what we're seeing coming out of Europe in the Article 29 Working Party is they're trying to apply the right to be forgotten, this, right to be anonymous, not just to Google.eu, but to Google.com. And there's an extraterritorial reach where the actions of one country or collection of countries are now extending to impact my way of searching on Google. And so how do we get lawmakers to come around to this realization about the huge trade barriers that are coming down the pike, as well as the extraterritorial reaches of some countries into the way that Americans get online and the way Americans experience these services?
I think that's an excellent question. I think we're going to have to start thinking differently about certain questions, such as extraterritoriality, because we're used to exports and imports throwing things over a wall. Okay? So once it's on this side, then it's on that side. It's only on one side at a time. When it comes to the internet starts out from a position of connectedness. And so it really has a very different feel to it than our previous definition of international trade. Right now, we're trying to deal with trade and data from an old framework, and it's bending, and it's going to start breaking. And what you've identified is one of the break points. Because from the European point of view, what they're asking for is quite logical. Okay? From another point of view, it's sort of insane. Okay? But that's where we are at this point, because we're trying to sort of treat the internet, which is cross-border by definition, as something that can be fragmented by countries. So partly, your question is great in this transition period, and there's a lot of questions that are similar to that, where you have these two visions that run up next to each other. I think, to be honest, we don't know where this is going to go. We don't know whether we're going to end up with a fragmented global internet with walled gardens, which is one logical implication of what you're talking about, or in which the infrastructure gets duplicated everywhere and we lose a lot of the benefits, or do the benefits seem so compelling that the protectionist urges are damped? It's just not so much of a economics question as it is a policy question.
Well, and going back to your example of throwing stuff over a wall, it's one thing if I try to throw my ball over the wall and you slap it back down and I still have that content. But in fact, rather than just returning it to me, you're actually dissolving it. So you're not only refusing to accept the information that I'm sending to a European country, but you're disallowing me to actually have that information myself.
Can I actually just insert one thing? For those of you watching, okay, the hashtag that's being used for this on Twitter seems to be hashtag digital economy. It's not picking up everything, but it's picking up a lot of the tweets that are being made on this, and so there's an active Twitter conversation going on if anybody's interested.
Thank you.
Well,
Would
tweeting
anyone-
while you're on a panel is very digital.
Would anyone else like to comment on this question of clashing norms and what it means for trade? No?
I'm going to respond to a slightly different part of the conversation, which is to do an even better job somehow as academics, thought leaders, influencers, et cetera, on looking at exactly these types of questions from the point of view of other countries and other markets. Because I do think that in the cases where countries have maybe pulled back on a data localization initiative, or decided to go a different route, it's often been because there was some hard thinking and looking at the facts and the prospects going forward for being able to have global access in multiple directions to data. And so when I read this study, one of the things I thought is, okay, who's going to do those types of studies for our trading partners? Because trade is not a zero-sum game. It's not if I get more, you get less, but rather we try to grow all of the economies in this way.
Any other comments? No? Can I just throw something back at you, if I may, just as a typical academic? Because I do look at this question from other countries, and just think if you're French and a Jew, and you saw on Twitter that Twitter had allowed, anti-Semitic remarks, and so you petitioned your government to censor that or filter that to some extent. So it goes both ways. It's a clash of norms. And so how do you find common ground on those norms, and does that belong in a trade agreement is the key question.
So a very good question. As a Jew, it definitely hits it home for me. And in general, countries, if they want to deny access to their country, that's kind of their right. That's nothing new. Countries have been doing that for years. If they don't want to allow one citizen from a foreign country to cross their border, that's fine. California doesn't allow you to import vegetables. That's California's prerogative. So with respect to just limiting access to its own country, while I personally don't think that's the right thing to do, because I truly believe in right to free expression and right to freedom of speech, that is a right for the country to do. But when it's used for purposes of trade barriers, because perhaps their businesses, their own companies have not yet evolved to begin to compete with American innovation, that's one thing. If it's an issue of extraterritorial reach, like I alluded to earlier, where it's not just limiting what French citizens can see, but limiting what German, Italian, Spanish citizens can see, I think once you begin dissolving those borders, like the internet has, it becomes a lot more dangerous, where you have one country's regime able to control free speech across the internet, and that's a little bit unsettling for me.
Well, just if I may, in comparing this for various countries, there's no government that has a staff person whose responsibility is to protect the one global internet. And what I mean by protect is to look at the impact of various public policies, regulatory, trade, et cetera, on the internet as a whole. And maybe that's something that every government needs to think about as we move towards, because we're not going to have universal norms on things like free speech, et cetera. Did anyone else want to comment?
I guess I would just, the example that you gave is an opinion where countries can construct, and in some cases have constructed, laws that prevent that sort of thing from being said or happening, or are aimed at that. I think that's maybe a little bit different than some of the things that the ECJ decision have implicated, which are, I mean, in some cases, facts that are fairly recent, that in the United States and elsewhere would be searchable online and would have a material impact on important things like creditworthiness that are being now proposed to be blocked in Europe if you want to go on the internet and complain that, you know, something is on there that's negative about you. And so I think there are shades here, first of all, and when you think about the positive things that an open internet provides, I would hope that governments around the world would sort of reconsider some of the things that they are doing to block access or curtail information that is available.
Let me just add one thing here. If you think about what the benefits of the open internet are to Europe, well, one thing, the example I always give is a European student can tap into a video of, say, a Stanford computer science class and develop human capital. So if you extend what your bad case ends up with a world in which Europe is cut off, it becomes more difficult, becomes more expensive to tap into data in the rest of the world because it's deemed to be offensive or potentially offensive. And so we could end up with, in some sense, two different strategies for growth. One strategy for growth is an open internet, open access of information across borders. Another strategy says that the cultural and political and human rights issues are more important than growth issues, which is a lot of what Europe, some people in Europe seem to be saying. PPI has actually spent a lot of time in Europe over the last couple of years dealing with exactly this, and it's perplexing from the U.S. point of view. We like to think that growth and employment is really the most important social goal, and not everybody agrees with us on that. And so it could be that some people, some countries decide that they are less interested in growth and are willing to actually pay for a walled internet.
Okay, thank you for those. This is really turning into an interesting discussion, and I agree with you. Those examples are not the same. One is about limited censorship in the face of very clear norms in one country versus the European Court of Justice decision, which led to global censorship. So thank you for that correction. I appreciate it.
Just in case, I was just being hypothetical. I'm not actually advocating censorship of any kind. So just in case that's right.
We're going to forget all that. You see it all out on the internet, and we're just going to wipe it out right now.
Please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, organizers. My name is Safili, a student of DeVry University, Arlington, Virginia, from Sierra Leone, West Africa. My question here this afternoon is for the Internet Governance Forum. We all know that the continent of Africa, in terms of internet connectivity is zero? And how will this digital economy be sustained or started in the continent of Africa?
Okay, that's a
But-
very important question. It's not quite the subject of today, but if anybody from the Internet Society, Paul or David or anyone has anyone? Please.
Hi, I'm Judith Halsey, I'm with the local DC Chapter 2. I think what this gentleman is also talking about is also the need for policies and regulatory environment that is open to public-private partnerships, and that is true public-private partnerships that will involve the private sector who wants to build out infrastructure in these countries, but needs stable regulatory environments. And they need to have that to make the investment, and they also need to understand how they're going to get returns. A lot of these private sectors want to do that, but the environment is just not right for them right there. And that's why it takes working with the government to set the right regulatory policies.
I just also have a couple comments, mostly from my experience in Istanbul at the Internet Governance Forum, because what was very interesting about that forum is there were very large groups of diplomats from Africa. It was very well represented. And I would encourage you to read the parts of this report around page 200 or so that talk about the small and medium-sized companies, because really that is Africa's challenge. And one of the things that became very evident, and this report actually does address that, is there aren't secure online payment methods in Africa in a lot of these areas. And so people are afraid to buy things over the internet, which impacts the ability of a local community even to sell their own handmade goods or be able to order food online. You need to be able to have a secure payment method in order to do that in the first instance. And that was one of the important themes, I think, that came out at the IGF. And I think there are some people who are looking at that and trying to develop a way so that people can pay online. The other point that many people were making about Africa, and is also made in this report, is really the significance of mobile technology, and that in some countries, as many as 75% of the country accesses the internet through their mobile phone or tablet. You don't necessarily have the broadband infrastructure. Now, I think we're all talking about how do you get the broadband infrastructure built, and can you build capacity, because I think that is the goal of all of the international community, to try to get that. But as a first step and sort of an entree to the internet, these mobile technologies can be very important in developing countries where you don't actually have an infrastructure yet.
Okay, why I'm saying this, the Rwanda, Paul Kagame, who is the president of Rwanda, immediately after the Rwanda genocide, he is the first president and the first country to initiate the one laptop per child project. Yes, in support with Nicholas Negroponte of MIT in Boston, Massachusetts. So over here, I saw how to bring this internet into the classroom. I was a teacher. I taught chemistry and geography back home for 13 years. So I did the research, studied the one laptop per child of Paul Kagame. I take that as sort of an example, bring back to Sierra Leone. My school system is that of a traditional type. You use the chalk, no whiteboard. So how to bridge that digital gap? This is my question. Yes. So I want this forum through Linda to help, because I've started my project to provide one laptop per child, so that Ethiopia has initiated it, Rwanda, Ghana, Gambia, Nigeria, South Africa. So this is the way that this digital economy will start from the grassroots in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Anyone want to comment?
I could just say one more thing, and this has nothing to do with my current position, but I was at the Federal Communications Commission for many years and happened to be there when we initiated the Schools and Libraries program, the E-rate program. And that was one way that we were able to get the sort of broadband infrastructure out to some of the communities is by hooking up a school or a library. And then what ended up happening is once that infrastructure costs, which by the way was subsidized by the US government, so that is something that, the economics have to be worked out within a country. Then what happened was broadband was able to then build off of that connection because you're in the local town already and the cost of spreading the wires from that school or library. So I think that's a model that the US definitely used back a couple decades ago that is applicable in a lot of these communities as well. So, best of luck.
I'll just make two very quick comments because I know we've got others to build on what Linda was saying. So the Internet Governance Forum that just took place in Istanbul, it happens every year, the global one, we had a local one housed here as well. And its focus really is on connecting the next billions. And so there was a great program. It's all online. All the transcripts are online. There will be even more of a focus, I think, on that theme going into next year. So there's a strong commitment. I remember the very first Internet Governance Forum, I met representatives from Africa, from East Africa. There were no undersea cables. Zero of the fiber optic connections to the rest of the world. As of about 4 years ago, there were. Now trying to connect those to the interior, get the tablets, get them in the schools and all that. A lot of hard work, but also a lot of progress, I think, every year. So thanks for your question.
Yes.
Good point about undersea cable.
Hi, I'm Jessica Nicholson from the Department of Commerce, and my question is for Mr. Stamp, and I think it's probably pretty straightforward. I was just interested in the survey and wondering if there were any plans to continue with the survey and, future iterations or to further develop it because there's so much interest in this issue and so few data on this topic.
Well, unfortunately, the survey was a one-time deal that we did for this particular report. We published in the appendix a lot of our survey data. Hopefully, folks out there can use that and build off of that. But for the purposes, for our purposes, it's our work is over of the survey.
Hopefully, all these anyone from the private industry who has interest in these issues maybe could help further this kind of study in the future.
Well, on the other hand, your work is heavily influenced by some of your colleagues up on the Hill, and so I know there is no shortage of interest up in the Finance Committee and Ways and Means Committee and other places, so suspect that there will be some groundswell of support for future work on this.
Thank you.
Final question.
Final question.
Final question.
Final Jeopardy.
It's Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group, and again, thank you for this forum. Just a very quick observation and then a question. Observation is that if I'm from USTR sitting in this room spearheading the negotiations on digital trade, I would be wondering where I go from here. I just wonder, I know you've written a bit about this and you distributed some material, Susan, for this event about what can we realistically, practically do with the Europeans on TTIP. Not necessarily a question, but just an observation that it's clear that we are running against a very significant cultural issue here, something akin perhaps digitally to the genetically engineered organism issue. It may just simply be non-negotiable. We'll see how well negotiators can do. The question, though, is on the Internet of Things, a new area. The question for the panel is, within the context of what we're talking about here this afternoon, what lessons have we learned about the problems that we have in cybersecurity, trade, and these kinds of things that we can try to get a bit ahead of the curve on the M2M rather than to play catch-up and maybe not learn the right lessons? What are the lessons that we can apply to that next frontier?
Okay, again, I think we're going to have to make that the last question. Does anyone want to answer it?
I'll give it a shot. When you go in, I'll go.
Well, the Internet of Things is very new in many ways and very familiar in many ways. I think the same thing. We saw the same thing when cloud services arose, and some of my colleagues would say, "But wait a minute, isn't this about data centers and hosting?" And we've been sending digital communications. We've been complying with different varying privacy regimes for a really long time, and so it's always one has to figure out. I often say, look at the Internet of Things. Think about what may be the policy concerns. Then identify which of them already have mechanisms for dealing with them and see if there are gaps. And I think there may be certain gaps. But in order for the Internet of Things or machine-to-machine services to flourish, they will need to have a very, how can I say this, a seamless cross-border data flow to them in order for the fully benefit different types of economies, particularly. So I think that perspective will be useful, and that hopefully a lot of the understandings we've gained in working on cross-border data flows already over the last 4 or 5 years will be beneficial there. And I will say in trade agreements, I keep going back to the fact that trade agreements have, for services, have always understood that services need to flow, but we also need to look after privacy and security, and do that in a, to the maximum extent possible, in a non or least trade restrictive way. So we've had this framework out there and been trying to implement it, I'd like to think with quite a bit of success, for decades.
So Dana, you ask a really interesting question. You know, the ITC made its task a little bit easier in this report by focusing on digitally intensive industries. Basically, the definition of the Internet of Things is that every industry becomes digitally intensive. And so what will happen is that right now about 20% of the economy, by my reckoning, is made up of highly digital industries. The other 80%, manufacturing and healthcare and so forth, is mostly not that digital yet. And the Internet of Things will change that. And so all of a sudden, the benefits of being digital and the disruptions of being digital will both increase exponentially. And along with that will become disruptions and issues in trade as well. So I'm not sure we can get ahead of this. This is such a big thing that I think we just have to grapple with the changes as they come up.
Wow. Daunting. Well, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our speakers for their excellent presentations. And feel free to mingle and ask questions. So thank you again. And we're going to have another event coming soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.